Commander Thane stood on the bridge of his warship and looked at the blue planet below. His black armor gleamed under the ship's lights, and his yellow eyes studied the data on his screen. Earth was his 18th hunting ground, and it would be an easy kill. The intelligence report said the creatures down there were soft and weak. They had barely learned to fly between their own stars, and their weapons were simple metal projectiles. Perfect prey for someone like him. The Korthek had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years. They were born on a world where everything tried to kill everything else. Only the strongest survived, and Thane was the strongest of them all. His claws could cut through steel, and his armor could stop plasma bolts. His ship carried weapons that could crack planets, and his hunting gear could track a target across continents. Thane activated his stealth systems and guided his ship toward the planet's surface. A storm was brewing in the northern hemisphere, and the thick clouds would hide his approach. Lightning flashed around his vessel as he descended through the atmosphere. The primitive beings below had no idea that death was coming for them. His ship's computer showed him the perfect landing spot, a dense forest far from any major settlements. He would establish a base there and begin his hunt. The locals would never know what hit them. Thane had done this 17 times before, and each time the pattern was the same. Land quietly, study the prey, pick off the weak ones first. Then move on to the settlements. The storm grew worse as he approached the landing zone. Lightning struck his ship twice, but his shields held. The primitive planet's magnetic field was stronger than expected, but nothing his advanced technology couldn't handle. Thane smiled as he prepared for landing. This would be over quickly. Then everything went wrong. A massive bolt of lightning hit his ship at the exact moment he passed through a magnetic field fluctuation. The combination overloaded his systems in a way that should have been impossible. Sparks flew from his control panels and alarms screamed through the bridge. His shields failed first, then his engines, then his navigation systems. The ship plummeted toward the forest like a falling star. Thane strapped himself into his command chair and activated his personal armor's emergency systems. The ship hit the ground with tremendous force, carving a deep furrow through the trees before coming to rest in a crater of its own making. Smoke filled the bridge, and Thane could hear the ship's hull creaking under the stress. He checked his systems and found most of them offline. The main computer was functional but running on backup power. His weapon systems were damaged but repairable. His hunting gear was scattered but mostly intact. Thane unsealed his helmet and breathed the planet's atmosphere. It was thicker than he preferred but acceptable. The gravity was lighter than his home world, which would give him an advantage. He activated his scanner and detected several settlements within a 50-kilometer radius. The closest was only 10 kilometers away. He gathered his portable equipment and climbed out of the wreckage. The ship was buried deep in the earth, and it would take time to dig it out. Some of his advanced tools were completely destroyed, but he still had his basic hunting gear. His phase shifter was damaged but functional. His energy rifle had a cracked power cell but would work for a few shots. His armor's stealth system was offline, but the protection was still intact. The forest around him was dense and green. Tall trees stretched toward the sky, and strange sounds echoed through the shadows. Thane's enhanced senses detected small creatures moving through the underbrush. The local wildlife seemed harmless enough. Nothing that could threaten a Korthek warrior. His scanner picked up the electromagnetic signature of the nearest settlement. It was a small cluster of buildings with perhaps 50 inhabitants. Thane would start there. He would study their routines, learn their weaknesses, and strike when they were most vulnerable. Then he would use their primitive materials to repair his ship and continue his hunt. The forest floor was soft under his feet as he moved toward his destination. His natural camouflage would hide him from the primitive sensors these creatures possessed. They had no idea that an apex predator was stalking them through their own backyard. Thane reached the edge of the settlement as the sun was setting. The buildings were made of processed wood and metal, crude but functional. Lights flickered on in windows as the inhabitants prepared for their rest period. Perfect night. was when predators hunted and prey was most vulnerable. He studied the settlement's layout through his scope. There were several large structures that appeared to be dwellings and a few smaller buildings that might be storage or workshops. Strange vehicles sat in cleared areas, probably their ground transportation. Everything looked exactly as primitive as the intelligence reports had indicated. A lone figure emerged from one of the buildings and walked toward the forest edge. Thane focused on the creature and felt a moment of surprise. It was larger than expected, standing almost as tall as a young Korthak. Its skin was pale and soft-looking, but its movements were confident and purposeful. The creature wore some kind of uniform and carried equipment that Thane's scanner couldn't immediately identify. It moved through the forest with surprising skill, avoiding obstacles and making very little noise. This was not the behavior of soft prey. This was the behavior of something that knew how to survive in hostile territory. Thane activated his stealth systems and began to follow the creature deeper into the forest. His first hunt on this world would teach him everything he needed to know about these beings. He would learn their strengths and weaknesses, their fears and their capabilities. Then he would use that knowledge to destroy them all. The creature stopped near a clearing and began examining the ground. Thane realized it was looking at the trail his ship had left when it crashed. The being was tracking him. It had found his landing site and was investigating. This level of awareness was unexpected but not concerning. Many prey species had developed basic tracking abilities. Thane decided to end this quickly. He would kill this one and examine its body. Then he would know exactly what kind of creatures he was dealing with. He raised his energy rifle and took aim at the creature's back. One shot would be enough to end this. Then the creature turned around and looked directly at him. The human stood perfectly still and stared directly at Thane's position. The creature's eyes were small and round, but they tracked his movement with impossible accuracy. Thane's stealth system was still active and should have made him invisible to primitive sensors. Yet this being was looking right at him as if he were standing in bright daylight. The human spoke in a calm voice that carried clearly through the forest. The words were meaningless to Thane, but the tone was not aggressive. It sounded almost like a greeting. The creature held its hands away from its body in what appeared to be a peaceful gesture. Thane kept his weapon trained on the target and tried to understand what was happening. His scanner finally identified the human's equipment. It was wearing some kind of uniform with reflective patches and carried a portable communication device. There was also a small cylinder attached to its belt and what looked like a primitive projectile weapon. The being was obviously some kind of local security force or military unit. The human took a step forward and spoke again. This time the words had a questioning tone. It was trying to communicate with him. Thane had never encountered prey that attempted to negotiate with its predator. Most creatures either fled in terror or attacked in desperation. This one seemed to be doing neither. Thane decided to end the standoff. He deactivated his stealth system and stepped into the clearing. The human's eyes widened when it saw him, but it didn't run. Instead, it slowly reached for the device on its belt. Thane raised his rifle and prepared to fire. The human's first move was not what he expected. Instead of drawing its weapon, the creature activated its communication device and spoke rapidly into it. Thane's universal translator was damaged, but he caught fragments of the transmission. The human was calling for backup and describing his appearance and location. Thane fired his energy rifle at the human's center mass. The bolt struck the creature and knocked it backward but didn't kill it. The human rolled behind a tree and came up with the small cylinder in its hand. It pointed the cylinder at Thane and sprayed some kind of chemical into his face. The spray hit Thane's sensitive nasal cavities and sent waves of pain through his nervous system. His eyes watered and his breathing became difficult. The chemical was some kind of defensive weapon designed to incapacitate attackers. He had never encountered anything like it. The human was already moving, using the trees for cover while keeping the communication device active. Thane could hear other voices responding to the transmission. The creature had called for reinforcements and they were coming. His simple ambush had become a tactical nightmare. Thane tried to pursue the human, But the chemical spray had affected his balance and coordination. He stumbled through the forest while the human's backup drew closer. He could hear vehicles approaching, and voices calling through the trees. The entire settlement was mobilizing to deal with the threat. The human emerged from behind, a tree with its projectile weapon drawn. The device was smaller than Thane expected, but the creature handled it with obvious skill. It aimed at his center mass and fired 3 times in rapid succession. The projectiles struck his armor and penetrated the damaged sections. Pain exploded through Thane's body as the metal projectiles found their mark. His armor was designed to stop energy weapons and plasma bolts, but these primitive bullets were punching through like his protection was made of cloth. He looked down at his wounds and saw his own blood seeping through the cracks in his armor. The human maintained its distance and kept its weapon trained on him. Other humans were arriving at the scene, emerging from vehicles and spreading out to surround him. They all carried similar weapons and moved with coordinated precision. These were not panicked civilians running from a monster. These were trained professionals responding to a threat. Thane activated his phase shifter and tried to escape through the trees. The device flickered and partially engaged, but the damage from the crash made it unreliable. He managed to phase through one tree but solidified inside another and had to claw his way out. The humans tracked his movement and adjusted their positions accordingly. One of the new arrivals was speaking into a communication device while pointing at Thane. The human was describing his abilities and calling for additional support. They had already figured out that he could phase through solid matter and were adapting their tactics. These creatures learned faster than any prey species he had ever encountered. The original human, the one that had found his crash site, was still coordinating the response. It moved through the forest with complete confidence despite facing a creature 3 times its size. The being showed no fear and no hesitation. It treated Thane like a dangerous animal that needed to be contained rather than a superior predator that should be worshipped. Thane tried to circle around behind the humans, but they had positioned themselves to cover all escape routes. More vehicles were arriving, and he could hear aircraft overhead. The local security forces were bringing heavy equipment to the scene. They were treating this as a military engagement rather than a simple contact with an unknown species. The human leader raised its weapon and fired again. This time the projectile struck Thane's damaged rifle and shattered the power cell. Sparks flew from the weapon and it became useless. The creature had deliberately targeted his equipment rather than trying to kill him. It wanted him alive, but helpless. Thane realized he was facing something he had never encountered before. These humans were not primitive prey animals. They were predators in their own right. They had weapons, tactics, and coordination that rivaled anything in the galaxy. They had turned his hunt into their trap without him even realizing it. He activated his emergency beacon and sent a brief message to his ship's computer. If he didn't survive this encounter, the data needed to be preserved. The Korthek Command had to know what they were really dealing with on this world. The humans were closing in from all sides now. Their weapons were trained on him, and their voices were calm and professional. They had done this before. They had faced unknown threats and survived. They had developed protocols and procedures for dealing with exactly this kind of situation. Thane's wounded body could no longer support his weight, and he collapsed to his knees. The humans approached cautiously but without fear. They kept their weapons ready but didn't fire. They were capturing him rather than killing him. They wanted to study him just as he had planned to study them. The irony was not lost on him. The hunter had become the hunted. The predator had become the prey. And the soft, primitive creatures he had come to destroy were the ones holding him at gunpoint in his own trap. The human leader was speaking to him again. The words were still meaningless, but the tone was different now. It was the voice of a victor talking to a defeated enemy. It was the sound of a species that had never learned to fear anything, including aliens from the stars. As the humans placed restraints on his wounded body, Thane finally understood what the intelligence reports had missed. Earth wasn't a planet full of prey animals. It was a world full of apex predators who had been preparing for war since the day they first looked up at the stars. Thane escaped from the humans during transport to their facility. The vehicle carrying him was primitive but sturdy, and his captors had underestimated his natural strength. He broke free from his restraints and phased through the vehicle's wall while it was moving. The humans pursued him, but he vanished into the forest before they could recapture him. His wounds were healing, but his equipment was mostly destroyed. He had his natural abilities and a few basic tools, but nothing like the advanced hunting gear he was accustomed to. The humans had taken his rifle, and his scanner was damaged beyond repair. He would have to rely on his instincts and his training. To survive, the next few weeks became a learning experience unlike anything in his long career. Thane tried to establish himself as the dominant predator in the region, but every attempt taught him something new about his prey. The humans were not just skilled fighters, they were adapted survivors who had turned their entire world into a training ground for conflict. His first target was a lone human he found hiking through the forest. The creature was miles from any settlement and appeared to be completely alone. Thane stalked it for hours, learning its movement patterns and identifying its weaknesses. The human seemed unaware of his presence and moved through the forest with casual confidence. When Thane finally attacked, the human's response was immediate and coordinated. It activated some kind of emergency device that sent a signal to its allies. It deployed several bright flares that burned even his enhanced vision. It used the terrain to its advantage, leading him into areas where his size and strength were disadvantages rather than assets. The human escaped while Thane was still trying to recover from the flares. Within minutes, aircraft were circling the area and search teams were combing the forest. The humans had communication networks that could mobilize entire communities in response to a single distress call. They had turned individual weakness into collective strength. Thane's second target was a small group of humans camping in a remote area. They had set up temporary shelters and were cooking food over an open fire. They appeared relaxed and vulnerable, exactly the kind of easy prey he was looking for. He spent 2 days observing them and planning his attack. The humans had posted guards during their rest periods. Their shelters were positioned to provide mutual support and clear fields of fire. They had weapons cached throughout their camp and detection systems that could identify approaching threats. What looked like a casual camping trip was actually a defensive position prepared by experienced soldiers. One of the humans was a former military specialist who had served in multiple combat zones. When Thane attacked, the human turned their campsite into a battlefield. Improvised explosives detonated around Thane's position. Wire traps caught his feet and sent him tumbling into concealed pits. The human had prepared for threats that didn't exist and accidentally created perfect counters to alien hunting techniques. Thane barely escaped with his life. His armor was damaged and his confidence was shattered. These humans were not just skilled fighters, they were paranoid survivors who prepared for every possible threat. They had taken the concept of defensive warfare and refined it to an art form. His third target was an isolated structure deep in the forest. The building appeared to be a simple dwelling occupied by a single human. Thane spent a week studying the location and identified what seemed to be the perfect hunting scenario. The human lived alone, had no immediate neighbors, and followed predictable routines. The human was named Rick, and he had been preparing for invasions his entire life. His isolated cabin was actually a fortress disguised as a simple dwelling. The walls were reinforced with steel plates and the windows were shooting positions. The surrounding forest was filled with traps, sensors, and concealed weapons. Rick had spent decades preparing for threats that ranged from foreign armies to natural disasters to alien invasions. He had stockpiled weapons, ammunition, food, and medical supplies. He had built underground tunnels, escape routes, and communication systems. He had turned his property into a killing ground that could stop anything short of a direct military assault. When Thane approached the cabin, he triggered the first layer of defenses. Motion sensors activated floodlights that illuminated the entire area. Speakers began broadcasting warnings in multiple languages. Automated weapon systems tracked his movement and prepared to fire. The human had created a defensive network that operated independently of his direct control. Thane tried to phase through the building's walls but discovered they were lined with metal mesh that disrupted his abilities. He attempted to approach from underground but found the basement was sealed and protected. He tried to attack from above, but the roof was reinforced and covered with detection systems. Rick engaged him from multiple positions using weapons that Thane had never encountered. Explosive projectiles detonated around him with devastating effect. Chemical weapons burned his skin and lungs. Electromagnetic pulses disrupted his remaining equipment. The human had prepared for every possible method of attack. The battle lasted for hours and ended with Thane's retreat. He was wounded, exhausted, and completely demoralized. A single human had defeated him using nothing but preparation, paranoia, and primitive technology. Rick had turned his fear of invasion into a defensive capability that surpassed anything in the Korthic arsenal. Thane found shelter in a cave and tried to understand what had happened. The humans were not just skilled individuals, they were representatives of a species that had evolved to survive in a hostile environment. They had learned to prepare for threats that didn't exist and accidentally created solutions to problems they had never encountered. Each human he fought possessed skills and knowledge that were specifically suited to defeating his hunting techniques. They had weapons designed to stop large predators. They had tactics developed through generations of warfare. They had communication systems that could coordinate responses across vast distances. They had turned their entire civilization into a defensive network. Thane began to intercept human communication signals and study their language. What he discovered was even more disturbing than their combat abilities. The humans were not just defending themselves against his attacks, they were actively hunting him. They had identified him as a threat and were systematically closing in on his position. Multiple human organizations were involved in the search. Military units were coordinating with civilian authorities. Scientists were analyzing the wreckage of his ship. Intelligence agencies were tracking his movements and predicting his behavior. The humans had turned his presence into a research project and a training exercise. They were learning from him faster than he was learning from them. Every encounter provided them with new data about his abilities and limitations. They were adapting their tactics in real time and sharing information across their entire network. The humans had turned his hunt into their educational opportunity. Thane realized that he was no longer the predator in this relationship. He had become the prey. The humans were stalking him with the same systematic efficiency that he had once used against his victims. They had turned his own hunting techniques against him and improved them beyond his recognition. The apex predator of 17 worlds was being systematically defeated by a species that had never left their own planet. The creatures he had dismissed as primitive prey were demonstrating capabilities that exceeded anything in the galactic community. They had evolved not just to survive, but to thrive in the face of impossible odds. As Thane huddled in his cave and listened to the search aircraft overhead, he finally understood the truth about Earth. It was not a hunting ground. It was a training facility, and the humans were not prey animals. They were the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. Thane spent the following weeks intercepting human communications and trying to understand their language. His universal translator was damaged but still functional enough to provide basic comprehension. What he learned changed his entire understanding of the species he was fighting. The humans were not primitive creatures who had stumbled into advanced technology. They were survivors of a death world who had systematically conquered every threat their planet could produce. Their history was an endless cycle of conflict, adaptation, and technological advancement driven by the constant need to survive. Their planet had tried to kill them with ice ages that lasted for thousands of years. They had survived by developing tools, fire, and social cooperation. When the ice retreated, they faced plagues that killed millions. They survived by developing medicine and sanitation. When they ran out of resources, they fought wars that lasted for generations. They survived by developing better weapons and more efficient killing techniques. Every challenge their world presented had been met with innovation and determination. They had learned to farm in hostile environments, build structures that could withstand natural disasters, and create societies that could function during times of crisis. They had turned their entire civilization into a survival mechanism. Thane studied their military history and felt a growing sense of dread. The humans had been fighting each other for their entire recorded history. They had developed strategies and technologies specifically designed to kill other humans. They had created weapons that could destroy entire cities and tactics that could coordinate millions of soldiers their conflicts had driven them to develop abilities that far exceeded anything the Korthik had ever encountered. They could fight in any environment, from frozen wastelands to burning deserts. They could coordinate attacks across vast distances using primitive communication systems. They could manufacture weapons and equipment using basic industrial processes. The humans had not just survived their hostile world, they had thrived in it. They had learned to use every resource available to them and had developed technologies that were crude but incredibly effective. Their weapons were simple but deadly. Their tactics were basic but devastatingly efficient. Thane began to understand why his hunting techniques had been so ineffective. The humans had spent thousands of years developing counters to every possible threat. They had fought predators larger than themselves and had learned to use intelligence and coordination to overcome physical disadvantages. They had faced enemies with superior weapons and had learned to adapt and improvise. The human communications revealed something even more disturbing. They were not just reacting to his presence, they were actively studying him. Military scientists were analyzing his equipment and trying to understand his technology. Behavioral experts were studying his attack patterns and developing psychological profiles. They were turning his invasion into a research project. The humans had designated him as a priority target and were coordinating their response across multiple organizations. Military units were tracking his movements. Intelligence agencies were monitoring his communications. Scientific teams were analyzing every piece of evidence he left behind. They had turned their entire civilization into a hunter-killer network. Thane realized that the humans were not just defending themselves against his attacks. They were treating him as a learning opportunity. Every encounter provided them with new data about alien technology and alien tactics. They were preparing for the possibility of future invasions by using him as a test subject. The scope of their preparation was staggering. They had developed protocols for dealing with unknown threats and had created organizations specifically designed to respond to alien contact. They had built detection systems, communication networks, and military units that existed solely to protect their world from outside invasion. The humans had been preparing for threats from space long before they had achieved spaceflight themselves. They had studied their own sky and had concluded that other intelligent species must exist. They had developed plans for contact, defense, and retaliation based on nothing but logical assumption and paranoid preparation. Thane studied their entertainment media and discovered that they had been imagining alien invasions for generations. They had created detailed scenarios about how such invasions might occur and had developed fictional responses to every possible threat. They had turned their imagination into a training tool for dealing with the unknown. Their military forces had conducted exercises based on these fictional scenarios. They had practiced fighting enemies with superior technology and had developed tactics for dealing with threats they had never encountered. They had prepared for warfare in environments they had never seen and had created weapons for enemies that might not exist. The humans had turned their entire species into a defensive network without even realizing it. Every individual was a potential soldier. Every community was a potential military base. Every resource was a potential weapon. They had created a civilization that was inherently prepared for total war. Thane began to understand that his invasion was not just failing, it was providing the humans with exactly what they needed to prepare for larger threats. His presence had activated their defensive systems and had given them experience dealing with alien technology and alien tactics. He had accidentally become their training instructor. The human military was already adapting their equipment and tactics based on their encounters with him. They had developed new weapons designed specifically to counter his abilities. They had created new protocols for dealing with phase-shifting enemies. They had improved their communication systems to coordinate responses to superhuman threats. The humans were not just surviving his attacks, they were evolving in response to them. They were becoming more dangerous with every encounter. They were learning to fight enemies like him and were preparing to face even greater threats. His invasion had made them stronger rather than weaker. Thane realized that the intelligence reports about Earth had been completely wrong. The humans were not primitive prey animals waiting to be conquered. They were apex predators who had been preparing for galactic warfare since the day they first looked up at the stars. They were a species that had evolved to survive impossible odds and had learned to thrive in the face of extinction. The Korthak had conquered 17 worlds by fighting creatures that had never faced a threat like them. The humans were different. They had been fighting threats like the Korthak for their entire evolutionary history. They had developed specific counters to every advantage the Korthak possessed. Thane understood now why the humans had been so effective against him. They were not just defending their world, they were practicing for the day when they would take the war to the stars. They were preparing to become the invaders rather than the invaded. They were getting ready to hunt the hunters. The apex predator of 17 worlds was being systematically defeated by a species that had never left their own planet. The creatures he had dismissed as primitive prey were demonstrating capabilities that exceeded anything in the galactic community. They had evolved not just to survive, but to dominate any environment they encountered. As Thane listened to the human communications and realized how completely he had underestimated them, he felt something he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, the apex predator was afraid. The final trap closed on Thane during the 4th week of his failed invasion. The humans had been patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless in their pursuit. They had studied his movement patterns, predicted his behavior, and slowly tightened a net around him that he hadn't even realized existed. Thane had taken shelter in what he thought was a secure cave system deep in the mountains. The location was remote, defensible, and had multiple escape routes. He had chosen it using all his training and experience as a hunter. What he hadn't realized was that the humans had been guiding him toward that exact location for days. The first sign of the trap was the aircraft overhead. Not the obvious search helicopters that had been tracking him for weeks, but silent drones that watched from high altitude. The humans had developed surveillance systems that could monitor vast areas without detection. They had been watching his every move and had known his location long before he realized they were there. The second sign was the subtle changes in the forest around him. Trees had been marked with small sensors. Trails had been blocked with nearly invisible barriers. The humans had been modifying his environment to control his movement without him noticing. They had turned the entire mountain range into a funnel that led directly to his current position. The third sign was the electromagnetic pulse that disabled his remaining equipment. The humans had positioned specialized weapons around his hideout and had activated them simultaneously. His phase shifter stopped working, his communicator went dead, and his emergency beacon was destroyed. He was cut off from his ship and his technology. Thane realized he had been outmaneuvered when the human forces revealed themselves. They emerged from concealed positions all around his cave, moving with coordinated precision. They had been in place for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. The apex predator had been reduced to cornered prey. The human leader was a woman named Amy who commanded the entire operation with calm efficiency. She spoke to him through a translation device while her soldiers maintained perfect firing positions. Her words were respectful but firm. She was offering him the chance to surrender rather than face inevitable defeat. Thane tried to fight his way out, but discovered that the humans had prepared for every possible response. They had studied his combat techniques and had developed specific counters to his abilities. When he tried to use his natural camouflage, they activated thermal imaging systems that revealed his position. When he tried to use his claws, they deployed riot shields that could stop his attacks. When he tried to use his strength, they used his own momentum against him with techniques that seemed impossible. The human soldiers moved like they had been fighting creatures like him their entire lives. They coordinated their attacks with split-second timing. They used terrain and equipment to negate his physical advantages. They fought as a unit rather than as individuals, turning his superior strength into a liability rather than an asset. Thane's final desperate gambit was to activate his ship's emergency beacon and send a warning to the Korthic fleet. He used his last functional device to broadcast a message across the galaxy. The transmission was brief but urgent, containing everything he had learned about the humans and their capabilities. The message was simple but devastating. Earth was not a hunting ground, it was a trap. The humans were not primitive prey animals. They were apex predators who had been preparing for galactic warfare since the dawn of their civilization. Any force that attempted to invade their world would face a species that had turned survival into an art form. The humans intercepted his transmission and analyzed it in real time. Their communication specialists were already working to decode Korthic language and technology. They were using his own distress call as a learning tool to understand alien communication systems. They had turned his warning into their advantage. Amy approached him while her soldiers maintained their positions. She was carrying medical supplies and restraint equipment rather than weapons. The humans were not planning to kill him, they were planning to capture him alive. They wanted to study him, learn from him, and eventually use him to understand his species. Thane realized that the humans had been planning this outcome from the beginning. They had never intended to simply kill the alien invader. They had designed their entire response to capture him intact so they could extract information about his technology, his species, and his civilization. They had turned his invasion into their intelligence-gathering operation. The medical treatment they provided was efficient and effective. The humans had developed techniques for dealing with alien physiology based on their analysis of his blood samples and equipment. They had created specialized restraints that could hold him without causing permanent damage. They had prepared facilities for long-term containment and study. As they transported him to their research facility, Thane listened to their communications and understood the full scope of what was happening. The humans were not just studying him as an individual, they were using him to prepare for contact with his entire species. They were developing weapons, tactics, and strategies based on their encounters with him. The facility where they took him was unlike anything he had expected. It was not a primitive prison but a sophisticated research complex designed specifically for studying alien technology and alien life forms. The humans had built it based on theoretical scenarios about alien contact they had been preparing for his arrival long before he had decided to come to Earth. The scientists who studied him were not afraid of him. They were fascinated by him. They treated him as a valuable research subject rather than a dangerous enemy. They analyzed his biology, his technology, and his psychology with the same systematic approach they had used to hunt him. They were learning everything they could about the Korthic species. Thane realized that the humans were not just preparing to defend their world from alien invasion. They were preparing to become the invaders themselves. They were using him to understand how galactic civilizations operated. They were developing the knowledge and technology they would need to take the war to the stars. The final revelation came when Amy explained their long-term plans. The humans had been monitoring galactic communications for years. They knew about the Korthic Empire and had been preparing for eventual contact. They had developed space-based weapons, faster-than-light communication systems, and military units specifically designed for interstellar warfare. The humans were not going to wait for the galaxy to come to them. They were preparing to go to the galaxy. They were planning to expand beyond their world and establish themselves as a galactic power. They were using his invasion as a training exercise for their own future conquests. Thane understood now why the intelligence reports about Earth had been so wrong. The humans were not primitive creatures who could be easily conquered. They were a species that had evolved to survive impossible odds and had learned to thrive in the face of extinction. They were preparing to become the apex predators of the galaxy. The hunter had become the hunted. The predator had become the prey. And the soft, primitive creatures he had come to destroy were preparing to hunt every species in the galaxy, including his own. The humans had turned his invasion into their graduation exercise from planetary to galactic warfare. Thane sat in his cell and listened to the humans. Preparing for their expansion into space, he realized that his failed invasion had accomplished something no Korthak had ever achieved. He had given the galaxy its most dangerous enemy. He had awakened a species that would not stop until it had conquered every world among the stars. The apex alien hunter had crashed on Earth and discovered that he was not the apex predator after all. The humans were, and they were coming for everyone.